Close your eyes and imagine the ocean from 20,000 feet, where the Pacific stretches in every direction like beaten metal, like a vast sheet of hammered steel that reflects the sun with such intensity it hurts to look directly at it, even through tinted goggles. The date is June 4th, 1942. The place is a coordinates on a map that will later be called the most important 5 minutes in naval history. The waters northeast of Midway Atoll, where the entire trajectory of the Pacific War hangs in a balance so delicate that a single decision, a single moment of hesitation or courage or random chance will determine whether Japan continues its expansion across the Pacific or whether the tide turns here, now, in this exact location where you are flying a Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber with a 1,000-pound bomb strapped beneath your fuselage and the knowledge that below you, invisible beneath clouds and distance, are 4 Japanese aircraft carriers that represent the cutting edge of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Your name is Norman Dusty Kleiss. You are 26 years old, a dive bomber pilot assigned to VB-6, Bombing Squadron 6 from the USS Enterprise. You have been flying for 3 hours, searching for the Japanese fleet, your fuel gauge dropping toward the point of no return, the point where you will have to choose between continuing the search and ensuring you have enough fuel to return to your carrier. Around you, 7 other Dauntless dive bombers maintain formation, 8 aircraft total, a pathetically small strike force sent to find and destroy an armada that includes 4 fleet carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and a dozen destroyers, the most powerful naval force Japan has ever assembled, commanded by Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the same man who planned and executed the attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months ago. You have found nothing. The ocean below is empty, or appears empty, the clouds obscuring whatever might lie beneath them. Your fuel is critical. Your squadron leader, Lieutenant Richard Best, is making calculations in his head, weighing the probability of finding the carriers against the certainty of running out of fuel and ditching in the ocean, where rescue is unlikely and survival is measured in hours before exposure or sharks or simple exhaustion claims you. The radio is silent except for static and the occasional terse communication between pilots. The tension is so thick you can taste it, metallic on your tongue, mixing with the smell of oil and hydraulic fluid and your own sweat despite the freezing temperature at altitude. And then you see it. Not the carriers, something else. A single aircraft, painted in the mottled green and gray camouflage of the Imperial Japanese Navy, banking toward your formation with a grace that speaks of thousands of hours of flight time, of a pilot who knows his aircraft the way a musician knows his instrument. It is a Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter, the legendary aircraft that has dominated Pacific skies since the war began, faster and more maneuverable than anything the Americans can field, piloted by men who trained for years before the war started, who represent the absolute elite of Japanese naval aviation. The zero closes on your formation with shocking speed, and you feel your stomach tighten with the familiar pre-combat cocktail of fear and adrenaline and the hyper-awareness that comes when you understand that the next 60 seconds might be your last. The pilot's name, though you do not know it and never will, is Kiyoshi Ogawa. He is 24 years old, 2 years younger than you, and he has been flying combat missions since the attack on Pearl Harbor, has shot down 3 American aircraft and damaged several more, has earned a reputation among his squadron mates as fearless to the point of recklessness. He was launched from the carrier Hiryu 2 hours ago on a routine combat air patrol, searching for exactly what he has just found: American bombers, vulnerable and loaded with ordnance, perfect targets for a skilled fighter pilot who can attack from altitude and superior speed. But something is wrong with his assessment of the situation. He sees your formation and makes a calculation that will haunt military analysts for decades afterward. He assumes you are torpedo bombers, low and slow aircraft that have already made their attack runs and now are fleeing, easy prey for a Zero that can overtake them and destroy them one by one. What he does not realize, what he cannot know because of the angle of his approach and the limitations of visual identification at high altitude, is that you are dive bombers, still laden with your bombs, still hunting, still dangerous. More critically, he does not realize that you have not yet found your targets, which means the carriers he is supposed to be protecting are still vulnerable, still unaware that 8 American dive bombers are less than 50 miles away and closing. Ogawa pulls alongside your formation, close enough that you can see his face through the canopy of his Zero, can see the leather flight helmet and the goggles and the expression of concentration as he evaluates his targets and plans his attack. You are looking at each other across perhaps 75 feet of empty air, 2 young men on opposite sides of a war neither of you started, each trained to kill each other efficiently and without hesitation. His aircraft is pristine, unmarked by combat damage, the rising sun insignia on his fuselage bright and sharp. Your Dauntless is scarred and oil-stained, a workhorse aircraft that lacks the elegance of the Zero but makes up for it in ruggedness and the ability to absorb punishment and keep flying. For a moment that stretches beyond normal time, neither of you fires. He is assessing, calculating, choosing which bomber to attack first. You are waiting, your hand near the controls, knowing that your rear gunner, Aviation radioman John Snowden, sitting behind you, has his twin .30 caliber machine guns trained on the Zero, waiting for the order to fire or the initiative to act on his own judgment. The other bombers in your formation are also watching, also waiting, caught in this suspended moment where action has not yet transformed into violence, where the possibility still exists that the Zero might simply break off, might decide 8 bombers are too many targets for a single fighter, might return to his carrier to report your position and let the combat air patrol deal with you in force. But Ogawa does not break off. He pulls ahead slightly, positioning himself for a stern attack on the lead aircraft, and in that movement you understand what is about to happen. He is going to attack. He is going to try to destroy your formation, one bomber at a time, starting with the squadron leader and working his way through the flight. And in doing so, in focusing on 8 bombers that he believes are already spent, already fleeing, he is about to make the most catastrophic tactical error of the entire battle, perhaps of the entire war. Because while he is engaging you, while he is spending precious minutes and ammunition on what he thinks are retreating torpedo bombers, your formation is going to continue toward the Japanese carriers, and those carriers, the Kaga, the Akagi, the Soryu, the Hiryu, are at this exact moment in their most vulnerable state, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled, their crews frantically preparing for a second strike on Midway,
completely unaware that American dive bombers are about to appear out of the sun and transform this battle from a Japanese victory into the beginning of Japan's defeat. Ogawa opens fire. The Zero's twin 20-millimeter cannons and two 7.7-millimeter machine guns erupt in a stream of tracers that arc toward Lieutenant Best's aircraft, and the formation scatters, not in panic, but in practiced defensive maneuver, each pilot braking in a different direction to complicate the Zero's targeting solution. You push your stick forward, diving slightly, feeling the Douglas respond with its characteristic heavy stability, and behind you, Snowden opens up with the twin .30s, the sound filling the cockpit like the world's angriest typewriter, brass casings ejecting in a stream that catches the sunlight as they...
The Zero breaks left, rolling with a grace that seems to mock the physics governing your own aircraft, and you understand immediately why these fighters have dominated Pacific skies for 6 months, why American pilots speak of them with a mixture of respect and dread. Ogawa's aircraft moves through the air like a blade through water, responsive to the slightest input, capable of maneuvers that would tear the wings off a Dauntless or send it tumbling into an unrecoverable spin. He comes around for another pass, and this time his cannons find their mark on one of your squadron mates, the shells punching through the fabric-covered rear fuselage with sounds like hammers striking sheet metal, loud enough to hear even over your own engine noise. But he has made his critical error. He is committed now to this engagement, locked into the tunnel vision that afflicts even the best fighter pilots when they have prey in their sights, when the predatory instinct overrides tactical awareness. Every second he spends attacking your formation is a second he is not reporting your position, not alerting the carriers, not vectoring other fighters to intercept. And every second you continue flying northeast toward the coordinates where your intelligence officers believe the Japanese fleet is positioned is a second closer to the moment when everything changes. Lieutenant Best makes a decision. Instead of continuing the defensive scatter, instead of trying to evade or fight the Zero on terms that favor the attacker, he reforms the squadron. His voice crackles over the radio, calm despite the circumstances, giving orders that seem insane until you understand the calculation behind them. Maintain formation, maintain course, maintain altitude. Let the rear gunners handle the Zero. The mission is not to survive this engagement. The mission is to find and destroy the carriers, and that mission takes precedence over individual survival, over the natural instinct to break and run, over everything except the objective. You pull back into formation, your Dauntless shuddering slightly as you adjust throttle and trim, and you can see the other bombers doing the same, 8 aircraft re-establishing the tight defensive box that allows the rear gunners to create overlapping fields of fire, to turn the formation into a floating fortress where any attacker has to run a gauntlet of .30 caliber bullets from multiple directions. Ogawa comes in again, this time from the starboard quarter, and the rear gunners open up in sequence, creating a stream of tracers that forces him to break off early, his shots going wide, his attack disrupted by the volume of defensive fire. He is good. You can see this in the way he maneuvers, in the way he uses his speed and altitude advantage, in the way he positions his aircraft to minimize exposure while maximizing his firing opportunities. But he is also alone, and 8 rear gunners firing in coordinated defense create a problem that skill and aircraft performance cannot entirely overcome. He makes 3 more passes, scoring hits on 2 aircraft, but failing to bring any of them down, failing to disrupt the formation's northeastward progress. And then, incredibly, you see his aircraft waggle its wings slightly, the universal aviation signal for acknowledgement or farewell, and he breaks off, climbing steeply,
and turning back toward the south, back toward where his carrier must be, back toward the fleet he is supposed to be protecting. You watch him disappear into the haze and distance, and you feel a strange mixture of relief and respect and something darker, the knowledge that you have just witnessed a man make a choice that may cost his nation the battle, may cost him his life when his superiors learn that he engaged bombers instead of reporting your position, that he prioritized kills over intelligence, that he allowed the tactical satisfaction of combat to override strategic necessity. You wonder if he realizes this. You wonder if in the climb back to altitude, in the long minutes of flight back to his carrier, the understanding will dawn that he has just made a mistake of historical proportions. But you do not have time to dwell on this, because ahead, through a gap in the clouds, you see them, the Japanese carriers. 4 of them in a loose box formation, their flight decks packed with aircraft, their wakes cutting white lines through the blue-gray ocean, their anti-aircraft guns already beginning to fire as they detect your approach. The sight sends a jolt of adrenaline through your system that is part fear and part something else, vindication perhaps, or the terrible satisfaction of finding what you have been searching for, of knowing that the next 5 minutes will determine whether you die uselessly in the ocean or die having struck a blow that matters. Lieutenant Best's voice comes over the radio again, still calm, still controlled, giving the order that transforms your formation from transport into weapon. Prepare to attack. Target is the carrier on the left. That's the Akagi. Deploy in sequence. Make your hits count. You know what this means. You know that dive bombing is not like level bombing where you release your ordnance from safe altitude and hope the bombs find their target. Dive bombing requires you to push over into a near vertical descent, to fall toward the target at speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour, to hold your nerve while anti-aircraft fire erupts around you and the altimeter spins downward and every instinct screams at you to pull out, to climb, to escape. You must fall to within 1,500 feet, sometimes lower, before releasing your bomb, close enough that the margin between successful attack and flying into your own explosion is measured in fractions of a second. You watch as Best pushes over first, his dauntless rolling inverted, and then pulling through into the dive, nose pointing almost straight down at the Akagi. The anti-aircraft fire intensifies, black puffs of exploding shells appearing in clusters around his aircraft, some close enough that the concussion must be rattling his cockpit, shaking his controls, making it almost impossible to maintain the precise dive angle necessary for accuracy. You count to 3, the standard interval to prevent mid-air collision during the attack, and then you push your own stick forward, feeling the familiar moment of weightlessness as gravity takes over, feeling the Dauntless accelerate into the dive with a speed that seems impossible for such a heavy aircraft. The Akagi fills your windscreen, growing from a model-sized object into something real and massive, a floating city of steel and wood, with a deck crowded with aircraft that are being frantically pushed aside to make room for the fighters trying to launch, trying to intercept you before you can release your bombs. You can see people on the deck, small figures running and pointing and manning the anti-aircraft guns that are firing directly at you now, the tracers rising to meet your descent like a deadly fireworks display. Your altimeter unwinds, 6,000 feet, 5,000, 4,000. The dive brakes are deployed, keeping your speed from exceeding the Dauntless's structural limits, but you are still falling so fast that the ocean and the carrier and the sky blur into a single rushing vision of movement and color and imminent impact. 3,000 feet.
You can see individual aircraft on the deck now, can identify them as Zeros and Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers, can see the Japanese naval ensign painted on the deck, can see the faces of the anti-aircraft gunners as they track your approach and fire and fire and fire, creating a wall of steel that you must fly through to reach release altitude. Something hits your aircraft. You feel it more than you hear it, a sharp impact followed by the high-pitched whistle of wind through a new hole in your fuselage. But the Dauntless continues to fly, continues to dive, continues to fall toward the target with the inevitability of gravity itself. 2,000 feet, 1,500. You are so close now that you can see the grain of the wooden deck, can see the bombs and torpedoes stacked beside the aircraft, awaiting rearming, can see the fuel hoses still connected to planes that were being serviced when your formation appeared overhead. And you understand in this moment why this target is so vulnerable, why the next few seconds will matter more than all the planning and strategy and intelligence that led to this attack. The Akagi is not ready for you. She is caught in the worst possible state. Flight deck crowded, ordnance exposed, fuel lines open, damage control teams dispersed. One bomb in the right place will not just damage this carrier, it will transform her into a floating funeral pyre. You reach release altitude, your thumb hovers over the bomb release button, and in the fraction of a second before you press it, you think of Agawa, the Zero pilot who engaged you instead of reporting your position, who chose immediate combat over strategic awareness, who perhaps is at this exact moment landing on one of these carriers, unaware that his decision has already sealed their fate. You press the button, the bomb falls away, and you pull back on the stick with all your strength.
The explosion is something you feel before you see, a shock wave that ripples through the air and catches your aircraft like a hand slapping at a fly, sending the Dauntless lurching sideways, even though you are already 1,000 feet above the carrier and climbing. You risk a glance back over your shoulder, craning your neck against the G-forces, and what you see will be burned into your memory with such clarity that 30 years later you will still be able to describe every detail. The Akagi's flight deck erupting in a geyser of flame and debris, the secondary explosions beginning as the ordnance stacked beside the aircraft ignites, the fire spreading with horrifying speed across the wooden deck where fuel and bombs and torpedoes are clustered in concentrations that would make any sane damage control officer weep. Your bomb hit. You know this with the certainty of a man who has spent hundreds of hours practicing this exact maneuver, who can read the geometry of explosion and debris pattern and understand that your 1,000-pound bomb struck within feet of where you aimed it, punching through the flight deck and detonating in the hangar below where more aircraft waited, where the fuel stores and ammunition magazines created a chain reaction that is now consuming the ship from the inside out. The Akagi is dying, not might die, not could die, is dying right now, in this moment, the flagship of the Kido Butai, the carrier strike force that attacked Pearl Harbor, transformed in seconds from the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy into a burning wreck that will have to be scuttled by her own escorts before the day is over. But you have no time to appreciate the magnitude of what you have just accomplished because the sky around you is still filled with anti-aircraft fire, and because other dive bombers are still pressing their attacks, and because staying in this airspace for 1 second longer than necessary is suicide. You bank hard left, jinking, varying your altitude and heading to make yourself a difficult target, and Snowden behind you is calling out positions of other aircraft, other threats, his voice tight with adrenaline but still functional, still doing his job. You can see the other carriers now, the Kaga taking hits from another squadron, the Soryu beginning to burn, the entire Japanese formation dissolving into chaos as decades of naval doctrine about carrier invulnerability collide with the reality of American dive bombers appearing out of the sun at the exact moment when those carriers were most vulnerable.
The scene below is apocalyptic. 3 carriers burning simultaneously, their decks obscured by smoke and flame, their crews abandoning ship or fighting fires that cannot be contained, their escorts maneuvering frantically to avoid collision while trying to provide anti-aircraft support and rescue survivors and maintain some semblance of formation in the face of disaster. You can see tiny figures jumping from the burning carriers into the ocean, can see lifeboats being lowered, can see destroyers moving in close despite the danger of secondary explosions. The scale of the destruction is almost incomprehensible. 20 minutes ago, these carriers represented the cutting edge of Japanese naval power, the ships that had struck Pearl Harbor and raided across the Pacific with impunity. Now they are funeral pyres, their aircraft and crews and offensive capability being consumed by fires that will burn for hours before the hulks finally slip beneath the surface. You check your fuel gauge and feel your stomach drop. The needle is deep in the red zone, far past the point where you should have turned back, past the point where reaching the Enterprise is mathematically possible unless the carrier has closed the distance significantly since you launched. You do a quick calculation in your head: current fuel, consumption rate, distance to last known carrier position, and arrive at a number that is not encouraging. You have perhaps 30 minutes of flight time remaining, maybe 45 if you lean the mixture to the point where the engine barely stays running. The Enterprise is at least 60 minutes away at economical cruise speed, closer to 90 minutes, given that you need to maintain altitude and combat readiness in case more zeros appear. Around you, the other Dauntless bombers are reforming into a loose defensive formation, all of them facing the same calculation, all of them understanding that they may have just traded their lives for those carriers, that survival is now a matter of fuel and distance, and whether the Enterprise's radar operators are good enough to vector them in before they run dry and ditch in the ocean. The radio crackles with terse exchanges, pilots reporting fuel states and damage, and the general consensus that this is going to be close, very close, the kind of close where some of you make it back and some of you don't, and there is very little you can do about it except maintain heading and hope. Below, the battle continues without you. You can see other American aircraft, torpedo bombers and fighters engaging the remaining Japanese ships, can see the 4th carrier, the Hiryu, still untouched and launching aircraft of her own, sending Zeros and dive bombers on a counterstrike that will find the Yorktown and deal her mortal wounds in revenge for the destruction of her sister ships. The battle has acquired a momentum independent of individual actions, has become a vast churning chaos of aircraft and ships and men killing each other with the industrial efficiency that defines modern war. Your part in it is over. You have dropped your bomb, scored your hit, done what you were sent to do. Now comes the harder part: surviving the aftermath, making it home, living long enough to file a report and sleep, and wake up tomorrow and do it all again. The minutes stretch. The ocean below is empty, featureless, a vast expanse of water that all looks identical, that offers no reference points or landmarks or indication of how far you have traveled or how far remains. Your fuel gauge continues its inexorable descent toward empty. The engine continues to run, though you imagine you can hear changes in its tone, hesitations that might be real or might be your imagination projecting fear onto mechanical function. Snowden is quiet behind you, conserving oxygen, conserving energy, understanding without being told that this flight has entered the phase where there is nothing to do except wait and see whether the fuel holds out, where the engine quits, where the Enterprise appears on the horizon before either of those things happens. And then, impossibly, you see it. Not the Enterprise, but the destroyer screen surrounding her, the outer ring of escorts that mark the location of the carrier task force. You feel something release in your chest, some tension you have been holding since the moment you pushed over into the dive, and you reduce power slightly to stretch the remaining fuel, beginning your descent toward the deck that represents safety, that represents the possibility of tomorrow.
Other dauntless bombers are appearing from different directions, all converging on the carrier, all making the same desperate fuel-conserving approach, some of them trailing smoke or showing obvious damage, but still flying, still navigating, still refusing to quit. You join the landing pattern, waiting your turn, watching as the aircraft ahead of you touch down one by one, some perfectly, some hard enough that you can see the landing gear compress and bounce, all of them rolling to a stop and being immediately pushed aside by the deck crew to make room for the next arrival. Your turn comes. You drop your landing gear and flaps, reduce power to just above stall speed, line up on the carrier's wake, and begin the final approach. The deck rises to meet you, pitching slightly in the ocean swells, requiring constant corrections to maintain alignment. You cross the carrier's stern, cut power, feel the tailhook catch the arresting wire, and the Dauntless slams to a halt with a deceleration that would be violent in any other context, but here feels like salvation, like the physical manifestation of survival. The engine quits before you can taxi clear, not sputters or coughs, just stops. The fuel tanks finally completely empty, the margin between making it back and ditching in the ocean measured in seconds, in the length of deck between the arresting wire and where your aircraft finally rolls to a stop. The deck crew pushes you aside manually, and you climb out of the cockpit on legs that shake from more than just the adrenaline leaving your system, from the simple physiological fact of having been under sustained stress for the past 4 hours, of having looked at death from multiple angles and somehow emerged intact. Lieutenant Best is already on deck, already surrounded by intelligence officers who are demanding details, coordinates, damage assessments, everything you can remember about the attack. You join the debriefing and you tell them what you saw. 3 carriers burning, possibly sinking, the Japanese formation in chaos, the attack successful beyond anything you dared hope. The intelligence officers make notes, ask clarifying questions, try to piece together a picture of the battle from the fragments provided by pilots who saw it from different angles at different times. And then someone asks about the Zero, the fighter that engaged your formation before you reached the carriers. You describe the encounter, the single aircraft, the attacks, the way he broke off and returned south. The intelligence officer looks puzzled. Just one, he asks? There should have been a full combat air patrol, at least a dozen fighters protecting those carriers. Where were the rest? You don't have an answer. You can only shrug and repeat what you saw. 1-0, 1 pilot, engaging 8 bombers while the carriers sat vulnerable below. The intelligence officer makes a note, and you can see
The hours after the attack blur into a sequence of mechanical actions performed by a body that is temporarily separated from conscious thought. You eat food you don't taste. You answer questions you barely hear. You strip off your flight suit, stiff with dried sweat and smelling of hydraulic fluid and cordite, and someone hands you coffee that you drink without registering whether it's hot or cold, strong or weak. Around you, other pilots are going through similar motions, men who look like they've aged a decade in the span of a single mission, their eyes carrying that 1,000-yard stare that comes from looking directly at your own mortality and discovering it was looking back. The battle continues without you. The carrier task force maneuvers constantly, launching and recovering aircraft as Japanese bombers from the Hiryu find the Yorktown and put 3 bombs into her, setting her ablaze and forcing her crew to abandon ship before damage control manages to save her, temporarily. You watch from the Enterprise's deck as more dive bombers launch to find and destroy the Hiryu, to complete the work you started, to ensure that all 4 of the carriers that struck Pearl Harbor are eliminated from the equation. The symmetry is not lost on anyone. 6 months ago, Japanese carriers attacked America while their nation was still technically at peace. Now, American carriers are destroying those same ships in what will later be recognized as the turning point of the Pacific War. But you are not thinking in terms of turning points or historical significance. You are thinking about fuel gauges and the way Ogawa's Zero moved through the air, and the moment when your bomb left the rack and gravity took over, and you committed to a dive that had only two possible outcomes: successful attack or death. You were thinking about the men on the Akagi, the sailors and pilots and mechanics who were doing their jobs when your bomb punched through their flight deck and their world exploded into fire and chaos and screaming. You were thinking about how thin the membrane is between being the killer and being the killed, how the difference comes down to fuel and timing and one Japanese fighter pilot's decision to engage rather than report. Sleep, when it finally comes that night, is fractured and shallow, interrupted by dreams where you are falling again, where the altimeter is unwinding and the anti-aircraft fire is rising to meet you, and you cannot remember whether you released the bomb or whether you are still carrying it, still diving, still locked in that eternal moment between commitment and impact. You wake in darkness, disoriented, reaching for controls that aren't there, before memory reasserts itself and you remember you are in your bunk on the Enterprise, alive. The intelligence reports arrive over the next days and weeks, pieced together from reconnaissance flights and submarine sightings and intercepted Japanese communications. All 4 carriers sunk. The Akagi scuttled by Japanese destroyers after burning for hours, her crew evacuated, but her hull too damaged to save. The Kaga gone down with heavy casualties. The Soryu destroyed so quickly that hundreds of men were trapped below decks. The Hiryu, the last to fall, found by American dive bombers in the afternoon and hit so hard that she too had to be abandoned, her admiral choosing to go down with his ship rather than face the disgrace of losing all 4 carriers in a single day. The numbers are staggering. Over 3,000 Japanese sailors and airmen dead, the cream of their naval aviation wiped out in one battle. The strategic balance of the Pacific shifted permanently in favor of the Americans. And somewhere in those casualty lists, though you will never see his name, is Ogawa. Or perhaps he survived. Perhaps he made it back to the Hiryu before she was hit, managed to ditch when she went down, was picked up by a destroyer and returned to Japan, where he faced court-martial for his failure to report the American bombers, where he tried to explain that he thought they were fleeing torpedo bombers, that he made a judgment call in the heat of combat, that war is chaos and perfect decisions are impossible when you have seconds to evaluate and act. Or perhaps he died heroically in the later defense of the carriers, shot down by American fighters or caught in the explosions that consumed the Hiryu. Or perhaps he lived through the war, survived Midway and the Marianas and Iwo Jima and all the other battles that ground the Japanese Navy to fragments, and spent the rest of his life wondering what would have happened if he had broken off and reported instead of attacking, if he had chosen intelligence over engagement, if that one decision had been different. You fly more missions, dozens of them, over the next 3 years. The war continues with the relentless momentum of a machine that cannot be stopped until it has consumed everything in its path. You bomb ships and installations and airfields. You watch friends die and new pilots arrive to replace them. You accumulate hours and kills and the deep bone weariness that comes from sustained combat operations, where every mission might be your last. But Midway remains different. Midway remains the mission you measure all others against.
the day when everything hung in balance and tipped in your favor because of skill and courage and timing, and because one enemy fighter pilot made a choice that helped seal his nation's fate. The war concludes in August 1945 with atomic fire over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, with surrender documents signed on the deck of the battleship Missouri, with the slow demobilization of millions of men who must now figure out how to return to civilian life after years of killing and being shot at and living with death as a constant companion. You return to America, to a world that seems both familiar and utterly alien, where people complain about rationing and traffic and problems that feel impossibly trivial compared to fuel states and anti-aircraft fire and the question of whether your bomb hit or missed. You marry, you have children, you build a life that has nothing to do with dive bombers or burning carriers or the 5 minutes over Midway when you fell through a sky full of steel toward a target that represented everything the enemy held dear. You work a normal job, attend parent-teacher conferences, worry about mortgages and college tuition and all the mundane concerns that constitute civilian existence. But part of you never leaves that cockpit, never stops diving, never seeing the Akagi's deck rushing up to meet you, and knowing that the next few seconds will determine whether you live or die, whether you succeed or fail, whether your life has meaning beyond mere survival. Decades pass. The veterans' organizations hold reunions, and you attend sometimes, drinking with men who understand without explanation what it was like, who carry their own versions of Midway or Guadalcanal or Iwo Jima, who know that the distance between the young man who flew those missions and the old man remembering them is both infinite and non-existent. You tell stories, but you leave out certain parts. The terror, the way your hands shook after landing, the dreams that still come sometimes, where you are falling and cannot pull out, where the ocean fills your windscreen and impact is inevitable, and you wake gasping. Historians interview you. They want details, want to reconstruct the battle with precision, want to understand how 8 dive bombers found 4 carriers at the exact moment when those carriers were most vulnerable, want to know about the zero that engaged you. You tell them what you remember, but memory is an unreliable witness, colored by time and repetition and the weight of knowing how the story ends. You remember Ogawa's aircraft pulling alongside, remember the grace of his maneuvers, remember the moment when he broke off and disappeared, but you cannot remember his face with certainty anymore, cannot recall if you actually saw his expression or if you have invented that detail over years of remembering, creating false precision where there was only brief visual contact and adrenaline and fear. In 1999, Japanese naval historians published a study of Midway that includes pilot rosters and combat records from the Kido Butai. You obtain a copy, though your Japanese is limited to a few words learned during the war. A friend translates portions for you, and buried in the appendices you find it, a brief mention of a Japanese Zero pilot who engaged American dive bombers northeast of the carrier formation.
You are 83 years old when you finally return to Midway. Not to the atoll itself, but to the coordinates, the exact position where the battle occurred, where 4 Japanese carriers burned and sank and took with them Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific. It is a memorial cruise, organized by veterans groups and naval historians, Japanese and American survivors sailing together over waters that consumed so many of their comrades 60 years earlier. The ocean looks exactly as you remember it, endless, indifferent,
the same hammered metal surface reflecting sunlight with an intensity that still makes you squint even through modern sunglasses. There are Japanese veterans on the ship, survivors from the Kido Butai, old men like yourself who were young once, who flew or sailed or fought, and somehow lived when so many others did not. You were introduced to them at a reception, shaking hands across a gulf that was once filled with bullets and bombs and hatred, but has somehow, impossibly, transformed into something else. Not friendship exactly, the wounds are too deep, the memories too sharp, but understanding, perhaps, recognition, the acknowledgement that you were all young men doing what your nations demanded, that the killing was structural rather than personal, that survival was mostly luck dressed up as skill or courage or divine favor. One of the Japanese veterans is a former Zero pilot. His name is Haruo Yoshino, and he flew from the Hiryu, launched on the counterstrike that damaged the Yorktown, landed back on his carrier just minutes before the American dive bombers arrived. He tells you this through a translator, his English limited to pleasantries and technical aviation terms. He describes the chaos on the Hiryu's deck, the frantic rearming and refueling, the moment when the lookouts spotted American aircraft overhead and it was already too late. The bombs were already falling. He escaped because he was below decks when the bombs hit, survived the fire and the flooding, and made it to the water where a destroyer picked him up hours later, half drowned and burned, but alive. You tell him about Ogawa, about the Zero pilot who engaged your formation instead of reporting your position, who might have changed the outcome of the battle if he had made a different choice. Yoshino's expression changes. He knows the name, he says, through the translator. Ogawa was in his squadron, a good pilot, aggressive, sometimes too aggressive, choosing combat over tactics, prioritizing the immediate satisfaction of a kill over the larger strategic picture. He was killed when the Hiryu went down, trapped below decks or overcome by smoke. His body never recovered. He was my friend, Yoshino says quietly, and the words need no translation, the grief in his voice transcending language. We trained together, flew together. He taught me how to execute a proper split S at low altitude. He was, Yoshino pauses, searching for words in English, finally settling on, brave, very brave, but sometimes brave is not enough. You nod, understanding perfectly what he means, understanding that bravery, untethered from judgment, is just another form of recklessness, that Ogawa's courage in engaging 8 bombers was also the error that allowed those bombers to reach their targets. The translator continues, and Yoshino tells you more, how Ogawa had a younger brother in the Imperial Army fighting in China, how he painted cherry blossoms on his Zero's fuselage, 1 blossom for each confirmed kill, how he spoke sometimes about the war ending, about returning to his family's farm in Kyushu, about teaching flying to civilian students in peacetime, how all those dreams died with him in the Hiryu's burning corridors when he was 24 years old and the war was barely 6 months old, and there were still 3 years of killing ahead before it finally ended in atomic fire and unconditional surrender. The memorial service is held on deck at sunset, the ship positioned as close as modern navigation can determine to where the carriers went down. Wreaths are thrown into the water, prayers are offered in Japanese and English, taps is played by an American bugler and answered by a Japanese trumpeter, playing a melody you don't recognize, but which carries the same weight of mourning,
the same acknowledgement of loss. You stand at the rail looking down at the ocean, and you think about the men below, thousands of them, Japanese and American both, their bodies claimed by the same water that now supports this memorial vessel, their bones scattered across the seabed, along with the wreckage of carriers and aircraft, and all the machinery of war that proved insufficient to protect them. You think about Ogawa making his choice in the seconds before he engaged your formation. Did he hesitate? Did he consider breaking off and reporting? Or did the training and the adrenaline and the fighter pilot's instinct to attack override everything else, make the decision automatic, transform him from thinking human being into weapon following its programming? You will never know. The moment is lost to history, exists only in the fragmentary records of a battle reconstructed from after-action reports and survivor testimony, and the forensic analysis of decisions made in seconds by men who had no way of knowing how those decisions would echo across decades. What you do know is this: if Ogawa had reported your formation's position and vector to the Kido Butai, the combat air patrol would have been vectored to intercept you. 8 dive bombers would have faced dozens of Zeros, the best fighter aircraft and pilots in the world at that moment in history. Some of you might have survived to press the attack, most would not. The carriers might have been hit anyway. There were other American squadrons converging on the same target, but the timing would have been different, the damage potentially less catastrophic, the outcome possibly altered in ways that cascade through history, like ripples spreading from a stone thrown into still water. Your life, your survival, your return to America, your marriage and children, and the 60 years you have lived since Midway exists because Ogawa chose to attack rather than report. This is an uncomfortable truth, a moral complexity that resists easy categorization. You owe your life to an enemy pilot's tactical error, to a decision made for the wrong reasons that nevertheless allowed you to complete your mission and escape. Should you be grateful? Should you feel guilty? Should you mourn him or acknowledge that his death was necessary for your survival? That war creates these impossible equations where one person's mistake becomes another's salvation. The memorial service ends. The wreaths float photocurrent, moving slowly apart, white shapes on darkening water. The Japanese veterans bow. The American veterans salute. And you stand there feeling the weight of all those years, all those lives, all the what-ifs and might-have-beens that constitute the shadow history running parallel to the one that actually happened. In that shadow history, Ogawa reports your position. Zeros intercept. Your bomb never falls. The Akagi survives. The battle's outcome shifts. Japan maintains naval superiority in the Pacific for months or years longer. More islands fall. More men die. The war extends, metastasizes, consumes more lives in its vast machinery of industrial slaughter. But that is not what happened. What happened is simpler and more terrible. Ogawa attacked. You survived. The carriers burned, the war turned, and history flowed forward in the channel carved by those events, carrying you and Yoshino and millions of others toward a future that could not have been predicted from the chaos of that June day when the ocean filled with burning ships and falling aircraft and men who discovered too late that their training and courage and sacrifice were insufficient to change what was coming. You die in 2016 at the age of 100, having outlived almost everyone who fought at Midway, having carried your memories and your survivor's guilt and your complicated relationship with that battle for 72 years. Your obituary mentions Midway prominently, describes your